Baylor Director of Athletics. We're now joined by Jon Wilner, Pac12 Hotline, and also the San Jose Mercury News, and many others. Jon, thank you. Paul, Catalina, Craig, and David Smoak, we appreciate your time. Let's start with today. How hot or legitimate is anything Stanford Cal in the ACC?
I lost him.
Okay. We'll try to get him, try to hook him up again. By the way, I just saw on the chat room, please like and subscribe when you can with what we do. I rarely ever say that, but the numbers, of course, have been soaring for the last 3.5 years, and we do appreciate you. Jon Wilner, Pac12 Hotline. Jon, how much smoke or how hot and legitimate is Stanford Cal in any conversations with the ACC?
I'm not sure I'd say it's hot. I would say warm, and I would probably put Big Ten conversations as cool but not cold. You know, both schools are pushing hard for membership in one of those two conferences. I think the Big Ten makes a lot of sense for them because then you got a 16 Western Division, and it would solve a lot of the travel demands on the athletes that the schools out west are facing, and the Big Ten, the 14 Big Ten schools in the Midwest, their athletes would have to go out the West Coast far fewer times if you had a 16 division. I think that makes a lot more sense, but it's going to get down to whether ESPN will pay for them to get into the ACC and whether Fox will pay for them to get into the Big Ten.
Jon, why these two schools in particular are on the outside looking in? What about, I mean, because we know all the great things, you know, gigantic, you know, endowments and educational giants and, I mean, elite when it comes to that. But how did they find themselves lost in the wilderness in all this?
TV ratings. I mean, really comes down to how the networks value, and in this case, it was Fox. I mean, Stanford and Cal, I don't think we're ever going to be, you know, like Washington and Oregon. They were not going to go into the Big 12 ever. So it's basically Fox's valuation, and are they worth, you know, the money that Fox has to pay to get them into the conference and pay them every year? Are they going to provide that much return based on viewership trends and their media market? And, you know, Stanford, if this had happened 4 or 5 years ago, Stanford would have been a no-brainer because they were a powerhouse for, you know, 6-8 years and did very well in TV ratings. But the program has fallen off at just the wrong time. And so Fox, to this point, did not put enough value on them to justify paying them.
Jon, I know that you were all over this story, you know, especially from the Pac perspective, and you, hey, let it be known, like, hey, they're in some danger. There's some things that didn't go right along the way, but just from your point of view, how did last Friday kind of unfold? I know everybody sort of explained, hey, they were in and then they were out, and then all of a sudden it was shocking and what have you, but just from your perspective, the end of the Pac in this form at least, what was just kind of the way that it unfolded on your end?
Well, I mean, it's kind of the way I thought if it broke apart, it was going to unfold how it did. The top existential threat to the Pac-12 was always the Big Ten. And as long as the Big Ten presidents and Fox were not interested in adding Oregon and Washington, the Pac-12 was going to stay together. And the Pac-12 had, I don't know, 10, 11 months when those two entities were kind of taking a snooze on the expansion front. And then they woke up and derailed it. I mean, the presidents, Pac-12 presidents for the other 7 schools woke up on Friday morning planning to sign their grant of rights. I mean, Arizona's president said they were going to put it in blood, so to speak. But the Big Ten and Fox worked Oregon and Washington overnight, and so that derailed the whole thing. But that was always the chief threat. And the Pac-12 did not take advantage of that huge window when the threat was not, didn't exist, didn't take advantage of that to get the deal done.
Wasn't that then also that perhaps the Big 12 was underrated, that what they could accomplish when Yormark stepped in line and got the deal done? I understand the Big Ten and the history and all that, very similar to the Pac-12, and Oregon, Washington pretty much was the death blow. But was there perhaps maybe not enough attention or enough respect for the Big 12?
I think Yormark did a perfect job executing the strategy that his presidents want. And he positioned the Big 12 to be a destination for the mountain schools. But I get back to the fact that, Colorado's a little bit different case because it's got 60 years in the Big 12. But for the Arizona schools in Utah, their preference was always to stay in the Pac-12, right? And you think about all the stuff that has happened in the Pac-12 in the last 13 months, USC, UCLA leave, the problems with the negotiations, they still were ready to sign. That was their preference unless they had no choice. And when Oregon and Washington left, they had no choice. But that's not to diminish the job Yormark did strategically in putting the Big 12 in position to take advantage of the opportunity if it had presented itself. And it did.
Why is George Kliavkoff still employed by the Pac-12?
Well, the Pac-12 currently consists, I believe, I am not 100% sure, but based on my reading of the bylaws, the Pac-12 currently consists of 4 schools that have voting rights. So if they want to get rid of him, it's Oregon State, Washington State, Stanford and Cal are the ones who would have to vote him out. He's got 3 years left on a contract that's paying him $3.5 million. So I don't know if they're taking that into account, but it's those schools have the power to make the change.
John, is there any chance? And again, I'm asking you because you're right there in the middle of it. Was there any chance? You'd mentioned Stanford and Cal were never going to join the Big 12. Was there almost a disdain for the Big 12 in many ways? And why perhaps when Kliavkoff said no to them a year ago and then came back and said, hey, you want to have a drink? Was that what it was in your opinion?
For sure. I mean, that's been the case. The Pac-12 has had an arrogant outlook on every conference that's not the Big Ten and maybe the ACC. The Pac-12 presidents have looked down upon every other conference for years. I mean, that's nothing new. They should have merged to form the strategic alliance years ago. Bob Bowlesby and Larry Scott talked about it pre-COVID, and there wasn't enough interest out here. Then they had the chance to add schools in the summer of 2021, and they didn't. And then they could have moved quicker on SMU and San Diego State. I know they're not in the Big 12, but the Pac-12 presidents have always taken a very high and mighty attitude about their conference and looked down upon the other ones that aren't the Big Ten. Absolutely.
John, so at $23-25 million, they would have signed that deal if Oregon and Washington had decided to take that medicine, even no linear and all that. They were just going to take the medicine and go?
They were going to take it, absolutely. They were all prepared. The other 7 were prepared at 6:30 Friday morning to sign. A few schools had even signed the document overnight, and they were all ready to do it. And then at 10, I think it was about 10 minutes before 7, Oregon and Washington let it be known to the other 7 that they were not going to sign. And so it all unraveled from there. But absolutely, they had the deal done overnight. Multiple presidents, including ASU and Arizona, have spoken about that publicly. It was a done deal. The way they viewed the media contract with Apple was that it was going to be difficult the first 2 years. It was a 5-year deal. It was going to be tough to swallow the first 2 years, but huge benefits the last 3 years. And then it just unraveled. I think what did it was, and I don't know this, guys, just to be clear, this is my own speculation. But what I think happened is that overnight, Oregon and Washington got a commitment from the Big Ten that they would get full shares of revenue in the next contract. So when the Big Ten goes back to market in 2030 for a contract that's going to span the 2030s, Oregon and Washington will get 100% shares of that deal.
The expansion piece of that's now it's a totally different expansion conversation, and we don't know what the Pac's going to be or exist or whatever. But the San Diego State and SMU stuff, while they were still in negotiations with Apple and whoever else, how close were those two to ever becoming members, John? And are you still sort of scratching your head a bit about just the order of things? Because it was always puzzling to me we'll negotiate and then we'll expand. I just felt like that was almost backwards in some ways, that you'd want to know who you have and negotiate with who you're going to have. But can you kind of just explain how close that ever really was with those two?
Oh, very close. I mean, those two schools thought they were in, and they thought they were going to be in on Friday because they thought that the grant of rights was going to get signed at 7 a.m. on Friday morning, and that, by the end of the day, those two schools would have membership invitations, or at least the state would. They were, they were the easy spot for Colorado, and in a lot of respects, that would have been an upgrade for the Pac-12, just San Diego State straight in for Colorado, partly because of the location that's so important. But, yeah, they were very close, and I agree with you. I never understood why they were doing it that way. To me, the Big 12 provided a model, right? The strength in numbers model that the Big 12 implemented, in the summer of 21 under Bowlesby when they got the 4 schools, and then they went to the TV networks with a solid 12, really. That was the model. And the Pac-12 looked at it and just, they just didn't get it.
Why not? Why, if they have all this academic prestige, these institutions that have all these brainiacs and all of this, John, how? How could they not get it?
They don't have, they do have brainiacs running those schools, but they don't know anything about sports.
Yeah.
And they don't know about sports media. And that's been proven time and time again. I mean, they signed off on the Pac12 Networks 12 years ago, and obviously that was a failure. And the whole thing with 7 different networks and all that, they don't know anything about sports media. At least most of them don't. There's a couple who are pretty savvy.
Sure.
Arizona and Washington State are pretty savvy. Don't have any idea. And so they're reliant upon the 2 commissioners that have been in place, and those commissioners have made some questionable or downright erroneous strategic decisions.
John, at media days when George Kliavkoff kind of fumbled the bag up on the podium that day, did you start to wonder if it was about to get more chaotic? Because it just was such a poor performance, and the first time we'd heard from him in months, and then that happened, and there was even less clarity than there was before he walked up there.
Well, no, I mean, I thought that his performance, was not a good performance, but it didn't change my view. I thought it was going to be dicey. I thought there was a good chance Colorado was going to be leaving, and that could have repercussions for the other, for the remaining 9, and that was the case. I mean, that was to me that I had half a dozen conversations with Pac-12 folks, and all of them were worried about Colorado at that point. And what was it, 5 days later? I can't remember my dates, but it was like 5 days later it happened. And, nobody was surprised that Colorado left.
John, what happens? I mean, I know it's the $64 million question is like who goes where and all of that, but obviously there's a lot of people that feel very badly for Oregon State and Washington State. We know Cal, Stanford apparently have, a couple of options, but as far as a brand, a name, the logo, the Pac, whatever, is that still a thing moving forward, or do you think that's on its dying legs?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I'm in that group. I feel terrible. So I'm not supposed to, get emotional at all about this kind of stuff, but I do feel really bad for Oregon State and Washington State. I mean, I would argue there's no athletic department in the country, in the Power 5, that does more with its resources than Washington State. They got the lowest budget in the Power 5. They've been to bowl games 7 years in a row. They really do a great job with what they have. And Oregon State does too. And they did nothing wrong. They are just the innocent victims of the realignment situation. And you worry that they're going to have to cut sports, that they're going to have to lay people off. And it's just really kind of gutting what's going on with the two of them. Now, I think the Pac-12 name, it may stay. I mean, if Stanford and Cal can't get into the ACC or Big Ten, I think there's a good chance that they band together these 4 schools and they try to rebuild something. And they could easily go into the American and grab a couple schools from the American to get them up to 6 for next season, and then they can add the top tier of the Mountain West for the 25 season. And so 2 years from now, they got a 10-team conference that's, got some decent football.
Is the Apple deal dead, though, with everyone leaving, with the 6 schools out the door? If it was $23 million or whatever it was in streaming, is anyone going to give them enough money in a TV deal if there's 6 teams to be able to move forward?
Well, the Apple deal as it was presented is dead.
Yeah.
It's expired. They could come up with another deal with Apple for less money. I mean, if you've got, you'd have some pretty good markets, for somebody. I don't know what Fox, part of it would depend on what Fox and CBS are looking at with the Mountain West. The Mountain West contract with those 2 networks expires, I think, at the end of the 25 football season. So, they may decide, Fox may decide, we'd rather, instead of just keeping the Mountain West, we would rather have, kind of a conference that includes a few of the Pac-12 schools and a few American schools. There'd be you get a lot of markets there. You get Seattle, Bay Area, San Diego, Dallas. It wouldn't be a bad move for Fox as kind of a replacement for what they have with the Mountain West.
You've been around a long time. You've seen a lot of different things, a lot of expansion, realignment, what have you. These last 2-3 years obviously have been as chaotic as it seems like ever, for most of us at least. What does all this tell you about the direction of college sports, but college football in particular, John? Just putting all the clues and pieces together, where do you think all this is shaping up to go?
Well, I mean, it's really I thought this for a long time. Fox and ESPN are the grandmasters in this chess game, and the conferences and the schools are the pawns. And the schools are put in that position because of the way the NCAA is structured, right? I mean, it would be very different if football had never been included in Title IX. Everything would be very different, right? Because of the economics that underline football and what that does to the structure of your athletic department. It puts the schools in the position where they got to chase the TV money. And I think that all we're going to see, if you think out 5-7 years, right, there's a good chance that streaming is going to be the main way fans consume live sports, right? And that was part of Kliakoff's strategy with Apple, was that by the time that contract ended, that's where you wanted to be. Apple is probably going to end up owning ESPN in a few years, right? And Amazon's coming too. But it's just going to be different faces in that chess game. Instead of ESPN Fox, maybe it's Apple and Amazon calling all the shots. But that's kind of where we're headed, I think.
John, we have Bob Thompson, who's been on with us probably half a dozen or maybe a dozen times in the last 13 months. You have him in your story. I didn't copy and paste it and publicize it, but I did get a chance to read it about maybe Bob Thompson, depending on what they do with Kliakoff, as an interim or at least as a consultant. I mean, this is kind of what he does. Yeah. And he's going to come on here in about 10 minutes, and I'll send you the segment we have. But okay. I think why not, right? What would it hurt them to do that?
Well, it wouldn't hurt at all because they need. I mean, that's going to be the key to rebuilding the conference. Would be they got to find a media deal, and so you hire a former Fox president to do that. I mean, to me, it makes all the sense in the world. I just don't see how they could go to the media companies, whether it's Apple or Fox or whoever, and try to get a deal with Kliakoff running the show. That doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense to me. Bob makes tons of, it's kind of like I thought back to the Big 12 situation, right? Didn't they bring in Chuck Venus for a year and a half?
Yep, they did.
After Beebe, before Bowlesby.
Uh-huh.
And Chuck obviously had deep experience in college sports. He wasn't a TV guy, but he hit exactly what the Big 12 needed at that time. And I think Bob would do the same thing out here.
Who among Stanford or Cal, and I know about the endowments, we also know at Stanford's like in a different stratosphere, could either one of them go at it for however long they needed to as an independent? Is that even on the table?
I think it's probably on the table, more so for Stanford than Cal, maybe for both. I mean, the way that would unfold is, they just don't like they can't get in the ACC and Big Ten, and they just don't like the option of trying to rebuild the Pac-12. So they stick football, football becomes independent, and then they put their they're Olympic sports, probably in the West Coast Conference. It's a better fit for them than maybe the Mountain West. And then they go at it as independents in football, and they try to position themselves to get in the Big Ten in 2030. Stanford, I mean, if Stanford wants to, they could buy the Pac-12. I mean, they got more money than God. They got more money than God. But that depends on the university being willing to spend money. If they want to, they could certainly exist financially as independents. The problem with independents, though, right, is the scheduling. And what do you do for good? Once the power leagues get into their conference play, you're kind of left scheduling Middle Tennessee State and Idaho State, and that's the problem.
I know this is a hypothetical, but if Stanford or Cal could either one have to join the Big 12 or give up football, what would they do?
Probably give up. Well, I should say that there's people who think that they should. There's been people who think they should give up football for many years, and part of that is because they see what's coming with the employee thing, right? When eventually the athletes are going to get deemed either employees or pseudo employees, and there's going to be a revenue sharing deal with the schools. And there's a lot of folks who think Stanford and Cal are getting out when that happens.
Yeah,
and other schools too. How are Northwestern and Vanderbilt and the Wake Forests of the world going to respond if they've got to share revenue with the players? But if that was their only choice, Big 12 or football, there would be some heavy discussions about that.
And Ed, final thing, you have been covering the Pac-12 for a long, long time. You have the podcast. You have your Pac-12 hotline. How Craig brought this up, but it's obviously been difficult. We're talking about Oregon State and Washington State. But when you look around, what do you see? How are you feeling?
I mean, I'm fascinated by what's going to happen with these four schools for sure. And then we got football season, and then I've always been covering the issues that matter to the schools, whether it's under the banner of they're playing under the banner of the Pac-12 or whatever. That doesn't really matter. I mean, I could just make the Pac-12 hotline the Wilner hotline and keep rolling.
Yeah, it's amazing. How many times did you wake up the next day after something you had reported and you went, what the hell is going on?
In these last 13 months?
Yeah.
Oh, my God. It's been, it's like if I was covering a team. Let's say I was covering Baylor, and they spent 13 months hiring a football coach. That's what it's been like, because you got to deal with the rumors. You got to deal with other media reports and determining what's true and what's not true. It's a very competitive situation. So it's, you're always thinking about it, what stories are out there. It has been incredible. I never would have guessed on June 30th, 2022, that the Pac-12 would still be trying to get this thing done 13 months later. It was incredible.
Jon, thanks for your time. We appreciate it. Good luck with the coverage moving forward with the four schools and whatever happens with them, Washington State, Oregon State, Stanford, and also Cal. Appreciate his time. When we